Copyth call came in on a Tuesday. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Not because someone screamed, or a window broke, or a car hadn't moved in too long. The call came in because a woman who lived in apartment 4 of a 3-story rental building couldn't stop smelling something she couldn't explain. She'd lived there 2 years. She knew the building's rhythms. She knew the smell of the hallway on laundry day, the faint mildew that crept up from the basement in July, the way food odors lingered near apartment 6 because the exhaust fan above their stove had been broken since the previous winter. She knew all of it. This was different. Officers arrived at 11:14 in the morning. They knocked on doors. They checked the basement. They walked the hallways with the maintenance supervisor who kept insisting, somewhat nervously, that everything was fine, that old buildings had old smells, that there was probably a dead animal somewhere in the ductwork. 40 minutes later, one of the officers noticed something in the wall of the 3rd-floor utility corridor, a seam that didn't belong. What they found on the other side of that wall, and what they found when they started asking questions about the man who had put it there, is the kind of thing that stays with you. Not because it's grotesque. Not because it involves violence. Though there is violence here, a kind. It stays with you because of how long it went on, and because of how many people almost noticed. To understand what was happening inside those walls, you have to understand what the building looked like from the outside. The Aldermore Apartments, that's what we'll call it. Using a composite name to protect identities still connected to ongoing civil proceedings, was the kind of property that real estate listings describe as charming and full of character, which is often the polite way of saying the bones are good, but nobody has invested in it seriously for 20 years. 3 floors, 11 units. Built in the early 1950s as workers' housing for a textile company that no longer exists. Converted to rentals sometime in the late 1970s. Sold twice after that. Most recently, about 8 years before any of this began. To a man we'll call Raymond Voss. Voss was in his mid-50s when he acquired the property. He wasn't a developer. He wasn't a real estate professional in the traditional sense. He'd worked most of his adult life in facilities management, hospitals, large institutional buildings, the kind of work that requires you to understand how buildings breathe, where the pipes run, how the HVAC systems connect, where the load-bearing walls are, and more importantly, where they aren't. Tenants who knew him in the early years of his ownership described him as thorough, responsive, even. Not warm exactly, but present. He'd show up personally for maintenance issues. He knew the building better than anyone. That part, at least, was unambiguously true. The tenants themselves were a cross-section of what you find in mid-range rental housing in a mid-sized city. Working families, older adults on fixed incomes, a few younger residents, students, or recent graduates who appreciated the price more than the amenities. People who, for the most part, kept to themselves and trusted that the building around them was exactly what it appeared to be. The woman who made the call, we'll call her Diane, because that's close to her real name, and she's asked that her full identity stay out of this, had moved into apartment 4 with her teenage son after a divorce. She was a home health aide. She worked long hours. She was, by her own description, not someone who made noise or caused trouble or involved herself in other people's business unless she had to. She had to. The smell started sometime in late autumn. She described it later to investigators as layered. There was something organic beneath something chemical, like someone had tried to cover something up. She thought, at first, it was the unit above hers. Apartment 7 had a rotating cast of short-term tenants and a history of maintenance issues. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She called the building's maintenance line twice. Both times she was told someone would come by to look. Nobody did. After the 3rd week, she called the city. That call, and everything it set in motion's where this story actually begins. The first officers on scene were expecting a code violation, maybe a hoarding situation, maybe a decomposing animal that had gotten into the ductwork, died, and was slowly making its presence known through the ventilation. These calls happen. It's not unusual. They were not expecting what they found. The building's superintendent, a younger man named Cal, employed by Voss for about 3 years, mostly for lawn maintenance and light repairs, met them in the lobby. He was cooperative, but visibly uncomfortable. He kept saying he didn't know anything about any smell. He kept saying the building was fine. He kept looking, investigators later noted, at the stairwell door. They walked the 3rd floor first because the smell was stronger there. The utility corridor on the 3rd floor runs the full width of the building, north to south, and is accessed by a door near the stairwell that most tenants never had reason to open. It houses the main water shutoffs, junction boxes for the electrical panels, and the primary ductwork that feeds the upper floor units. It is, in the language of building management, a mechanical space. Functional, unremarkable, except for one thing. On the north wall of that corridor, about halfway down, there was a section of drywall that had been framed and finished to look like the rest of the wall. Same paint, same texture, close enough, in dim light, that you wouldn't necessarily notice it. But the officer who first saw it had grown up doing construction work with his father, and he noticed. The seam was wrong. The lines didn't match the natural spacing of the panels. There was a slight variation in the paint sheen in one corner. Newer paint over older. The kind of thing you only see if you're looking for it, or if the light hits it right. He pressed on it. It gave. What was behind that wall was not a body. I want to be clear about that, because in this kind of story, that's always the first assumption. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a crime scene in any conventional sense. It was a room, approximately 6 feet wide, about 14 feet long, low ceiling just under 6 feet, which meant anyone of average height would have to slightly bow their head. The room ran between the utility corridor and the exterior wall of the building, occupying a structural cavity that appeared on no official floor plan. Inside, a cot with a sleeping bag, a small battery-powered lamp, several containers of water, non-perishable food, a 5-gallon bucket with a sealed lid, a small fan on a low shelf, and on a wooden crate serving as a desk, a laptop computer, a notebook, and a small stack of folders. The folders contained financial documents, lease agreements, bank statements, correspondence with attorneys. The laptop, when investigators later accessed it, contained years of surveillance footage. Raymond Voss was not in the room when officers found it, but it was clear he had been there recently. The sleeping bag was compressed, recently slept in. There was a half-eaten meal beside the cot. The battery on the lamp was nearly full. He had left not long ago. The search that followed, the calls that went out, the questions that started being asked of tenants, the deeper examination of the building itself, took the rest of that day and into the next morning. And what emerged was a picture so methodical, so deliberate in its construction, that investigators initially struggled to frame it in familiar terms. This was not the work of someone who had snapped. This was not impulsive. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This had been planned over years. Understanding what Raymond Voss had been doing requires understanding who he was before he did it. And that means going back further than the purchase of the Aldermore building. It means going back to a personality and a life history that, in retrospect, made this particular outcome almost legible. Voss had never been married. He had no children that anyone knew of. He was described by former colleagues in facilities management as exceptionally competent and exceptionally private. Not cold, exactly. People who worked with him said he was capable of warmth, of humor, of genuine interest in other people, but on his own terms. Entirely on his own terms. He was the kind of person who needed to understand the systems around him completely before he would relax into them. This showed up in his professional life. Colleagues noted that he would sometimes over-engineer solutions to maintenance problems, spending 3 times as long as necessary on a repair because he needed to understand not just the symptom, but every possible cause and every possible consequence of each repair option. Thorough to the point of obsession, one former supervisor told an investigator. It also showed up, more quietly, in his personal life. People who knew him socially, and they were few, described him as hyper-vigilant about his privacy. He didn't give out his home address. He paid for things in cash when he could. He kept his social media presence either non-existent or entirely false. He was not, to be clear, a paranoid person in the clinical sense. He functioned normally. He held jobs. He paid his taxes. But there was a persistent, underlying need for control over who had access to him and when. That need, and what it ultimately drove him to do, is the quiet center of this entire story. When Voss purchased the Aldermore building, he was, by most external measures, doing well. He had savings. He had a decent credit profile. He'd managed facilities for a regional hospital system for over a decade and had accumulated a solid understanding of commercial real estate in the process. Buying a rental property wasn't a stretch. It made sense. What didn't make sense, what nobody noticed for a very long time, was that Voss never actually rented a home for himself after acquiring the building. He told people he was renting a small place across town. He told them an address. The address existed. The building at that address was real. But Raymond Voss had no lease there, had no record of ever having lived there, had no utilities in his name at that address. He had simply offered an address when one was socially required of him, and no one had ever verified it. Because, why would they? What? The financial documents in those folders revealed, and this took time. It took forensic accountants and a careful reconstruction of several years of records, was that Voss had, with great precision, reorganized his life around the Aldermore building in a way that was essentially invisible from the outside. He had reduced his personal financial footprint to almost nothing. His accounts were minimal. His purchases were largely cash. His income from the building's rent rolls, roughly 11 units, modest rents, nothing spectacular, was being funneled through a small LLC in a way that was legally unremarkable, but that had the effect of making his actual living situation entirely opaque. He wasn't breaking the law by not having a formal address on record. Not technically. Many people live in informal situations. Many people are between places and list a family member's address on documents. The specific constellation of choices Voss made didn't trip any single alarm, but taken together, they told a story. Raymond Voss had, at some point in the years following his purchase of the building, decided that the building was his home, not his investment, not his side income, his home, and he had proceeded to make it so quietly, systematically, over a period that investigators eventually estimated at somewhere between 4 and 6 years. The hidden room had not been built overnight. The Aldermore building, like many mid-century constructions, was built with certain inefficiencies baked into its design. The exterior walls are thick, insulated for the climate, built before the standardization of construction methods that came in the 1970s and 82nd. The internal layout had shifted twice over the decades. Walls moved, rooms subdivided, a common area on the third floor converted into 2 studio units sometime in the 1980s. These changes created several interstitial spaces, gaps between what the building was and what it had become. Voss knew this because Voss had spent years managing the building himself, often doing repairs personally. He had, over time, developed a more detailed understanding of the Aldermore structural reality than any official blueprint reflected. The room he built occupied one of those interstitial spaces, a gap between the original exterior wall and the framing of the utility corridor, a gap that had never been formally addressed. That had simply been drywalled over on the corridor side during a renovation in the early 2000s, before Voss owned the property. What Voss did was remove the drywall on the corridor side, reinforce the space, add a concealed access panel, run a small ventilation line off the existing ductwork, and outfit the interior with the minimum required to sustain human habitation. It was not comfortable. It was not pleasant. The dimensions alone tell you that. 6 feet wide, 14 feet long, a ceiling that requires you to hunch, no windows, controlled ventilation, a waste management solution that was, investigators said diplomatically, functional but limiting. But it worked. For years. The question that investigators and later the mental health professionals involved in the case kept circling back to was why. Why this, specifically? Why not simply rent a modest apartment somewhere? Why not live in one of the building's own units? He owned the building. He could have designated any unit as his personal residence. There was no legal barrier to that. Why the wall? The answer to that question is not simple, and I want to be careful here about the difference between what we know and what has been inferred. Some of what follows reflects the conclusions of a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case. Some of it comes from the notebook found in the room, which Voss apparently used as a kind of ongoing log, though not a diary in the conventional sense. And some of it is, I'll tell you plainly, an attempt to reason through a set of choices that don't yield to easy explanation. The notebook contained entries over several years. They were not emotional. They were not confessional. They were largely practical observations about the building, maintenance notes, tenant behavior logs. But interspersed throughout, and more frequent in later years, were entries that revealed something about his state of mind. One entry, dated roughly 2 years before the discovery, read, Southwest Unit Tenant 3 has been using the basement storage locker that belongs to Unit 4. I recorded the incident. No confrontation necessary. The record exists. Another, undated, venting in 3 North is underperforming. Adjusted intake baffled. No change in air quality. Will monitor. And I know this building better than it knows itself. That's not arrogance. That's just true. That last line is worth sitting with. Because the picture that emerged slowly, through the notebook, through the surveillance system, through interviews with tenants who slowly began connecting things they had half noticed over the years, was of a man who had not snapped or deteriorated. A man who had arrived, through a long private process, at a particular conclusion about how he wanted to exist in the world. He wanted to be in the system without being visible to it. He wanted to observe without being observed. He wanted the security of deep familiarity with his environment and the privacy of being entirely unknown within it. The building gave him both. From inside the walls, Raymond Voss could hear, at various times and with varying clarity, what was happening in the apartments around him. The ventilation system, which he had modified over the years, was not designed for surveillance, but it functioned that way. He could hear arguments, television programs, phone calls. He had placed, in several locations throughout the building, small cameras discreet, well-positioned that fed to his laptop. He knew which tenants were home and when. He knew their patterns. He was not, as far as investigators could determine, using this information sexually, or for blackmail, or for any kind of active harm. He was not watching people in private moments in any prurient sense. The camera placements were largely limited to common areas, hallways, the lobby, the mailbox alcove, the laundry room. The footage was archival. He kept it organized by date and unit number, like a building manager reviewing security footage. But he did use it. He used it to manage tenants in ways they couldn't trace back to him. When a tenant was late on rent, he knew before they told him because he'd seen them stressed, distracted, having hushed financial conversations in the hallway. He knew when couples were on the verge of breaking up, which often preceded a lease termination. He knew when someone new had moved in with a tenant who was supposed to be living alone, violating their lease. He managed all of it from inside the wall, through emails sent from a laptop, through maintenance requests routed through the super, through a careful, years-long performance of being a remote landlord when he was, in fact, never more than 30 feet away. I want to pause here and talk about the people on the other side of that wall, because this part of the story is easy to flatten into something abstract. The surveillance, the control, the unusual psychology of the person doing it, and in doing that, you lose the actual human weight of what was happening. 11 units. At the time of the discovery, 8 of them occupied. Somewhere between 12 and 15 people living in that building, depending on unreported cohabitants and the fluid nature of who was actually sleeping there on any given night. These people went about their lives in the genuine belief that they had the privacy that every person deserves in their home. They had bad days and good days. They argued with their partners and laughed at their televisions and cried when things were hard. They believed that the walls around them were walls, not occupied space, not a vantage point. They were wrong, and they didn't know they were wrong. The law takes a somewhat careful and not entirely satisfying position on what Raymond Voss did. The camera placements in common areas, hallways, the lobby occupied genuinely contested legal territory. because landlords do have some latitude in monitoring common spaces and buildings they own. The cameras did not extend into private units. The audio that reached Voss through the ventilation system was, legally speaking, a more complicated question because he hadn't installed recording equipment for that purpose. The building's own design had created a condition he was exploiting. None of this made it acceptable, but it created real challenges for prosecution. The violation that is clearest and most serious, the one that landed hardest on everyone involved, was simply this. Every person who signed a lease at the Aldermore had agreed to rent a private space from a landlord who would not be present in the building except for maintenance and inspection purposes. That was the implicit contract. That was what every one of them believed. They were living inside. Raymond Voss had never left. He had been there the entire time. Diane, the woman in apartment 4, the one who made the call, described her reaction not as fear, exactly, but as a kind of vertigo. Like the floor had shifted. She said, "I kept thinking about all the nights I came home tired and just sat in the hallway for a few minutes before I went inside. Just sat there on the floor with my back against the wall because I needed a minute before I went in and had to be a parent. And I couldn't stop thinking about that." She wasn't the only one. A man in apartment 6, who had lived there almost as long as Voss had owned the building, said he went back through every interaction he'd ever had with the landlord and started seeing them differently. "There was a time," he said, "when Voss knew something was wrong with my refrigerator before I called it in. I thought he was just a good landlord. He said he'd gotten a heads up from the super. I never questioned it." The super, Cal, was interviewed extensively. He was cleared of direct involvement in the surveillance. He appears to have been genuinely unaware of the room and its full implications. But he had, over 3 years of working for Voss, become accustomed to Voss seeming to know things he shouldn't know. He had told himself explanations. He had not asked questions. That, too, is part of this story. The way people in proximity to something wrong will find ways to not see it, because the alternative, really seeing it, requires them to do something about it. By the morning after the initial discovery, the case had shifted from a code violation inquiry to something that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. The detectives assigned to it, 2 of them, from a property crimes unit that had never handled anything quite like this, began pulling on threads. The first thread was financial. Voss's LLC was legitimate. His tax filings were in order. He had reported rental income, claimed appropriate deductions, filed on time every year. Nothing in his financial record was obviously wrong. But the forensic accountant noticed something in the texture of the records, a pattern of expenses that didn't quite match what the building needed. Over-investment in materials, purchases of tools and supplies at a volume slightly above what maintaining 11 units would require. When they cross-referenced those purchases with the construction materials that would have been needed to build and maintain the hidden room, the numbers aligned with an unsettling precision. He had hidden it in plain sight, in a column labeled Building Improvements. The second thread was the surveillance footage itself. The laptop had approximately 4 years of organized video. The detectives reviewed it not in full, because that would have taken months, but in representative samples, and what they described was something like a parallel archive of the building's life. Ordinary moments. People checking their mail, carrying groceries, having conversations in the laundry room. Nothing explicitly criminal captured, nothing lurid, but the act of recording it, the years of it, the organization of it. The fact that he had watched these specific people, in their specific building, going about their specific lives while living 30 feet away in a space they didn't know existed. That required a framework that the detectives found difficult to construct. One of them later said in a recorded statement, "In 22 years, I've worked cases where people did terrible things quickly. I've worked cases where they planned terrible things for a long time. What I hadn't worked was a case where somebody had planned something for a long time, and the thing they'd planned wasn't technically a crime, or wasn't fully a crime. We kept asking ourselves what law had been broken, and we kept getting unsatisfying answers." Raymond Voss was located 3 days after the discovery. He had not fled far. He was staying at a motel about 40 miles from the city, paying cash, registered under a name that was close enough to his own that it might have been a mistake rather than deception. He did not run when officers arrived. He did not appear surprised to see them. He came out of the motel room in clean clothes, carrying a small bag. He looked, by the accounts of the officers who picked him up, like a man who had been expecting this and had decided to handle it a certain way. He said, "I assume this is about the building." He said nothing else until he had an attorney. The formal interview with Voss, which took place over 2 sessions, with counsel present, is where the story gets its most revealing details, and also, in some ways, its most frustrating ones. Voss was cooperative. He was factual. He corrected the detectives when they stated something imprecisely, not aggressively, but as a matter of apparent compulsion toward accuracy. He confirmed the existence of the room. He confirmed the duration of his habitation, approximately 5.5 years. He confirmed the surveillance system. He did not apologize. He also did not celebrate it or frame it as something exceptional. He spoke about it the way a person might speak about an unconventional living arrangement they'd come to through practical necessity, as if the strangeness of it was something only visible from a certain angle. The detective asked him why he hadn't simply lived in one of the units. Voss paused for a long moment and then said, "Because then I would have been a tenant in my own building, and a tenant can always be asked to leave." That answer generated a lot of subsequent analysis, and I think it deserves careful unpacking rather than quick interpretation. The obvious reading is about control. A tenant has legal obligations and legal vulnerabilities. A person inside the walls has neither. He had engineered himself into a position of maximum stability, maximum security, by making himself, in a practical sense, invisible to the systems that govern residential occupancy. But the forensic psychologist who reviewed the case offered a second reading, which I think sits alongside the first, rather than replacing it. She noted that Voss had spent his professional life inside institutional buildings, hospitals, large facilities, places where the building itself was the constant and the people inside it were variables. He had managed those buildings and those people, or rather, managed the environment that shaped those people's experiences for decades. He understood, in a way most people don't, how much the physical structure of a building determines the experience of living within it. Owning the Aldermore had, she suggested, given him something he may not have had words for at the time he began pursuing it. It had given him a building he could fully know, not manage for someone else, not maintain for an institution. Know the way you know your own body, or the house you grew up in, or the face of someone you've looked at for a very long time. And the wall, she suggested, was less about spying on tenants than it was about achieving a particular relationship with the structure itself. The tenants were almost incidental. The building was the point. Whether that interpretation excuses anything, contextualizes anything, or simply explains something that still remains unjustifiable, that's something you'll have to sit with yourself. What I will say is that the tenants, when they heard this interpretation, were not comforted by it, and they shouldn't have been. Being incidental to someone else's psychology is not the same as being unharmed by it. The people in that building had lived, for years, in proximity to someone who saw them as part of the environment rather than as people with full claims to their own privacy and space. That's its own kind of violation. The charges that were ultimately filed against Raymond Voss were a patchwork, which is a reflection of how poorly existing law is equipped to handle a situation like this. The camera placements in common areas were largely unchargeable, given the building's ownership structure and the legal ambiguity around common spaces. The audio access through the ventilation was ruled inadmissible as evidence of a crime on its own. What the prosecution was able to establish was a pattern of fraud. Voss had represented himself to various parties in insurance filings, in correspondence with the City Housing Authority, in his own lease agreements as a property manager who did not reside at the property. That representation was material to several transactions. It was demonstrably false. It had been maintained over years. There were also housing code violations related to the unpermitted construction. The room, whatever else it was, had been built without permits, without inspection, and in a way that modified the building's fire egress configuration in ways that were not compliant. Voss ultimately pleaded to a reduced set of charges that resulted in a sentence of time served, a significant fine, and the mandatory sale of the Aldermore building. He was barred, as part of the plea, from owning or managing residential rental property in the state for 15 years. He served no additional jail time. The tenants who chose to pursue civil claims had more success. A settlement was reached, the terms sealed, which is common, that involved the proceeds from the building's sale. Most of the tenants had moved out within weeks of the discovery. Only 2 remained through the change of ownership, and both of them left within the year. The building itself sold quickly to a property management company that immediately gutted the 3rd-floor utility corridor, filled the hidden room with concrete, and did a full structural inspection before re-tenanting the units. Whatever the Aldermore building had been under Raymond Voss, whatever private world he had built and maintained inside it, it became, quite literally, a wall. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this case, about what it represents beyond the surface facts, beyond the criminal and legal framework, beyond even the psychological analysis. Here's what I keep coming back to. Raymond Voss was not a monster. I want to be careful saying that, because the people he wronged deserve their reaction to him, and their reaction is one of violation and betrayal and a very legitimate anger. He is not absolved by being comprehensible, but he was comprehensible. He was someone who had found, in a building and in the walls of a building, a relationship with space and security and control that most people find in families, in communities, in a life lived openly among other people. He had found it in concrete and drywall and ductwork and footage that he watched alone, organized and dated, on a laptop in a room that no one knew existed. And the part that I think is most worth sitting with, the part I keep returning to, is that it worked. For 5.5 years, it worked. Not morally, not legally, not entirely, but practically, it worked. He built a life inside a structure that was supposed to belong to other people, and it held, and it sustained him, and no one knew. Until a smell, until something organic leaked through the ventilation of a building he thought he understood completely, and a woman in apartment 4 noticed it, and held on to the noticing long enough to make a call. There's a version of this story that ends differently, where Voss had better waste management, where the ventilation ran cleaner, where Diane chalked the smell up to the building's age and let it go, where another year passed, and then another. The margin between discovery and indefinite concealment was very small. That's not a comfortable thing to acknowledge. We tend to think that the wrong things eventually surface, that systems catch what they're supposed to catch, that buildings contain what they're supposed to contain, and people occupy the spaces they're supposed to occupy, and the records match the reality. This case is a reminder that none of that is guaranteed, that the gap between what we believe about the world around us and what is actually true inside it can be very large, and that sometimes that gap is occupied. For Diane, and for the other tenants, what comes after a case like this isn't resolution in any meaningful sense. The legal process concluded. The building changed hands. Life moved on. But the thing that changed, the thing that doesn't and change, is the felt sense of a space. She said, in one of our conversations, I don't go into a room the same way anymore. I know that sounds strange, but I knock. Even in my own apartment, even alone, I knock. She laughed when she said it. A small, quiet laugh that wasn't really about finding it funny. Some knowledge, once you have it, reorganizes everything that came before it. And some things, once you suspect them, become impossible to fully dismiss. Raymond Voss understood buildings. He understood load-bearing walls and ventilation systems and the interstitial spaces that construction leaves behind. But he miscalculated one thing. He thought the building was his to know completely. He thought that if he understood every inch of it, every seam, every duct, every undocumented cavity, that it was, in a sense that mattered, his. He never accounted for the fact that other people understood it too. Not technically, not architecturally, but in the way that people understand a space when they live inside it, when they know its rhythms, when something shifts in the way it breathes, and they notice. He knew the building. They knew when something was wrong, and in the end, that was enough.